Well, that last chapter was a bit frightening at times. Hopefully didn't scare you too much. And we are now on the last chapter. It's been a journey with Maya. I've really enjoyed kind of exploring the world through her experiences, and really liked how the author has kind of described and put really visual imagery in our heads of all the different insects and creatures that she has met along her journey, and all the lessons that she's learnt as well. I hope you've enjoyed it as well, and I think let's go with the last chapter, which is The Queen's Friend. The noise of battle awoke Maya out of a brief sleep. She jumped up straight away and wanted to dash out and help defend the city, but soon realised that she was too weak to be of any help. A group of struggling combats came rolling towards her. One of them was a strong young hornet, an officer, and Maya judged by his badge, who was defending himself unlaid against an overwhelming number of bees. The struggling nut drew nearer. To Maya's horror, it left one dead bee after another in its wake. But numbers finally told against the giant. Whole clusters of bees, ready to die rather than let go, hung to his arms and legs and feelers, and their stings were beginning to pierce between the rings of his breast. Maya saw him drop down exhausted, without cry or complaint, fighting to the very end. Neither singing for mercy, nor revelling his opponents, he went down to his hornet's death. The bees left him and hurried back to the entrance to throw themselves anew into the conflict. Maya's heart was beating stormingly. She slipped over to the hornet. He laid curled up in the twilight, still breathing. She counted about 20 stings, most of them in the forepart of his body, leaving his golden armour quite whole and sound. Seeing he was still alive, she hurried away to bring water and honey to cheer the dying man, she thought. But he shook his head and waved her off with his hand. "I take what I want," he said proudly. "I don't care for gifts." "Oh," said Maya, "I only thought you might be thirsty." The young officer smiled at her, then said, not sadly, but with a strange earnestness, "I must die." The little bee could not reply. For the first time in her life, she seemed to comprehend what it meant to have to die, and death seemed much closer when someone else was about to die than when her own life had been imperiled in the spider's web. "If there were only something I could do," she said, and burst into tears. The dying hornet made no answer. He opened his eyes once again and heaved a deep breath for the last time. Half an hour later, he was thrown down onto the grass outside the hive along with his dead comrades. Little Maya never forgot what she had learnt from this brief farewell. She knew now, for all time, that her enemies were beings like herself, loving life as she did and having to die a hard death. She thought of the flower sprite who had told her of his rebirth when nature sent forth her blossoms again in the morning spring, and she longed to know whether the other creatures would, like the sprite, come back to the light of life after they had died the death of the earth. "I will believe it is so," she said softly. A messenger came down and summoned her to the Queen's presence. She found the full court assembled in the royal reception room. Her legs shook. She scarcely dared to raise her eyes before the monarch and so many Dindriches. A number of the officers of the Queen's staff were missing, and the gathering was unusually solemn. Yet a gleam of exultation seemed to light every brow, as if the consciousness of triumph and new glory one encircled like everyone, like an invisible halo. The Queen rose, made her way unattended through the assemblage, went up to Maya and took her in her arms. This Maya had never expected. Not this. The measure of her joy was full to overflowing. She broke down and wept. The bees were deeply stirred. There was not one among them who did not share Maya's happiness, who was not deeply grateful for the little bee's deed. Maya now had to tell her whole story. Everybody wanted to know how she'd learned of the hornet's plans, and how she had succeeded in breaking out of the awful prison from which no bee had ever escaped before. So Maya told them of all the remarkable things she had seen and heard, of Miss Lovely Dear with the glittering wings of the grasshopper, of Thekla the spider, of Puck, and of how splendidly Bobby had come to her rescue. When she told of the sprite and the human beings, it was so quiet in the hall you could hear the generators in the back of the hive kneading the wax. "Ah," said the Queen, "who'd have thought the sprites were so lovely?" She smiled to herself with a look of melancholy and longing, as people will long for beauty. And everyone smiled the same smile. "How did the song of the sprite go?" she asked. "Say it again. I'd like to learn it by heart." Maya repeated the song of the sprite. "My soul is that which breaths anew from all of loveliness and grace, and as it flows from God's own face, it flows from his creations too." There was silence for a while. The only sound was a restrained sobbing in the back of the hall, probably someone thinking of a friend who had been lost. Maya went on with her story. When she came to the hornets, the bees' eyes darkened and widened. Each imagined himself in the situation in which one of their number had been, and quivered and drew a deep breath. "Awful," said the Queen. "Perfectly awful." Everyone murmured something to the same effect. "And so," Maya ended, "I reached home, and I sue for you your Majesty's pardon 1,000 times. Oh, no one bore the little bee ill will for having run away from the hive. You may imagine they did not." The Queen put her arm round Maya's neck. "You did not forget your home and your people," she said kindly. "In your heart you were loyal, so will be loyal to you. Henceforth you shall stay by my side and help me conduct the affairs of the state. In that way, I think your experiences, all the things you have learnt, will be made to serve the greatest good of your people and your country." Cheers of approval greeted the Queen's words. So ends the story of the adventures of Maya the bee. They say her work contributed greatly to the good of everyone, and she came to be the highest respected and loved by her people. Sometimes on quiet evenings she went for a brief hour's conversation with Cassandra, peaceful little room where the ancient dame lived now on pension honey. There Maya told the young bees who listened to her eagerly stories of her adventures, which we have lived through with her. And that is the end. And now for you to go and take your own adventures and see where they may take you and who you find and learn on those. Thank you for listening. It's been a pleasure reading, and on to the next story. Bye bye.